Under an obsidian sky, the stars of truth shine with a brilliance that can only be seen in the deepest darkness. Join our nighttime journey through the mysteries of the soul and the secrets of the digital age. Click subscribe now and let the darkness reveal the light you seek. The snow came down sideways that February morning, the kind of cold that gets into your bones and reminds you that you're 63 years old and have no business standing outside on a front porch without a coat. But I stood there anyway, the way I'd been standing in one frozen place or another for the past 3 years. Ever since my daughter Claire disappeared the night before she was supposed to sign the inheritance papers. 3 years. People say time heals things. Those people have never lost a child. My name is Daniel Mercer. I spent 31 years as a high school history teacher in Knoxville, Tennessee. I coached junior varsity baseball for 20 of those years. I drove a used Ford pickup and I grilled on weekends, and I mowed my own lawn even after my knees started complaining about it. I was ordinary, in every good way. A man can be ordinary. And then one Tuesday in October, 3 years ago, my daughter Claire drove away from my house after Sunday dinner and never came home. She was 31 years old. She had her mother's green eyes and her grandmother's stubbornness, and a laugh that could fill up a room like sunlight fills up a jar. She was a kindergarten teacher. She volunteered at the animal shelter on Saturdays. She was the kind of person who remembered your birthday and showed up when things got hard. She was, without question, the best thing I had ever done with my life. And then she was gone. The night she disappeared, Claire had been staying with me for the weekend. Our house, my house now, since her mother passed in 2019, sits on a quiet street in the Sequoia Hills neighborhood. Big oak trees, and old brick sidewalks, and neighbors who've known each other long enough to wave without smiling. Claire had come for Sunday dinner, the way she did most weeks, and we had talked about her grandfather's estate. My father had passed that previous spring, and he had left Claire a sum of money, $240,000, the result of a life lived carefully and a small piece of land in East Tennessee that turned out to be worth something when a developer came calling. Claire was supposed to go to the attorney's office on Monday morning to sign the final transfer documents. She never made it. When I called her Monday afternoon and got no answer, I told myself she was busy. When she didn't answer Tuesday, I drove to her apartment. Her cat was inside, hungry and scared. Her bed had not been slept in. Her phone went straight to voicemail. I called the police that same evening, and a young officer with a sympathetic face sat across from me at my kitchen table and explained very gently, very carefully, as though I were made of something fragile, that adults have the right to leave, that there was no sign of foul play, that Claire was a grown woman who had perhaps simply needed a change. I told him that Claire would never leave her cat unfed. He wrote that down. The police investigation lasted, as far as I could determine, about 2 weeks before it slowed to nothing. The detective assigned to the case, a man named Garrett, who smelled like cigarettes and communicated mostly in shrugs, told me in November that there were no leads, no evidence of a crime, and no reason to believe Claire had not left of her own choosing. The inheritance paperwork had never been completed. The money sat in a legal hold, and my daughter was simply absent from the world, the way a light goes absent when you flip the switch. I want to tell you that I handled those first months with dignity. I want to tell you I was strong the way fathers are supposed to be strong. But the truth is that I sat in Claire's childhood bedroom for most of November and held a stuffed rabbit she'd had since she was 4 years old. And I talked to the rabbit because talking to the rabbit was the only thing that made the silence in the house feel smaller. I stopped grilling. I stopped mowing the lawn. My neighbor Dorothy brought me casseroles twice a week, and I put them in the refrigerator and forgot about them until they went bad. My brother Roy drove up from Chattanooga in December and stayed for a week and tried to get me to eat regular meals and go for walks. Roy was the practical one, always had been. He made phone calls. He hired a private investigator, a former Knox County Sheriff's deputy named Pete Allison, who spent 3 months going through Claire's phone records and bank statements and came back to us in March with the information that Claire had withdrawn $400 from an ATM on the night she disappeared and had not used her bank account or her phone since. Pete Allison told us, not unkindly, that people who disappear and leave no trail usually don't want to be found. I thanked him and paid his invoice and did not believe a word of it. Because here is what Pete Allison did not know, and what the detective named Garrett had never thought to ask about. 3 weeks before Claire disappeared, she had called me on a Wednesday evening and said something that I had filed away at the time as stress, as overthinking, as the ordinary worry of a conscientious young woman dealing with unfamiliar legal territory. She had said, "Dad, I think something's wrong with Grandfather's estate. I've been looking at the numbers, and I think someone has been moving money around." I had asked her what she meant. She'd said she wasn't sure yet. She said she had been going through the documents the attorney's office had sent her, and something didn't add up. She said she was going to talk to someone she trusted before she raised any alarms. I told her to be careful. She said she would. 3 weeks later, she was gone. I have replayed that phone call 10,000 times. In the shower, in the truck, in the dark, at 2 in the morning, when the house made its settling sounds, and I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, and missing my daughter, with a ferocity that I can only describe as physical, a weight pressing on my sternum like a hand flat against my chest, pushing down. I told Detective Garrett about the phone call. He noted it. Nothing came of it. I told Pete Allison about the phone call. He looked into the estate attorney, a man named Lawrence Wick, who had handled my father's affairs for 15 years, and found nothing irregular in the public records. Wick was 67 years old, a respected member of the Knoxville Bar, a church deacon, a past president of the local Rotary chapter. He had a son named Brandon who worked as his office manager, a tall and handsome young man who drove a car that seemed expensive for a law office manager's salary but whose finances Pete could not access without cause. Pete Allison gave me his final report and shook my hand, and I was back to where I started. 3 years. The lawn grew, and I paid a neighborhood kid to cut it. Dorothy kept bringing casseroles, and I got better about eating them. I went back to teaching in January of that first year, because staying home was worse than going, and because my students needed me, and because Claire would have been furious if she'd known I was sitting in her childhood bedroom talking to a stuffed rabbit. I taught my classes, and I coached baseball, and on the weekends I went through boxes, financial records, legal documents, anything I could find related to my father's estate. I was not a lawyer. I was not an investigator. I was a 60-year-old history teacher who had coached too many seasons to know how to quit when the game was still going. And then, on a Tuesday morning in February, 3 years and 4 months after Claire vanished, a woman knocked on my front door. I almost didn't answer it. I was in the back of the house, going through a filing box I'd pulled from the closet the night before. Documents my father had kept from the original land purchase in the 1980s. The knock came a second time, and I put down the papers and walked to the front door in my reading glasses and my flannel shirt and opened it. She was in her early 50s, I guessed. Short, gray-streaked hair, cut close. She wore a dark green winter coat and carried a canvas tote bag that was clearly heavy. She looked at me the way people look at you when they've been practicing what they're going to say and they're afraid they'll lose their nerve. "Mr. Mercer?" she said. "That's me. My name is Patricia Odom. I was Claire's colleague at Riverside Elementary." She paused. "I think I know what happened to your daughter, and I think I know who's responsible. And I'm sorry it took me this long to come to you. I was afraid. But I'm more afraid now of what happens if I stay quiet." My hand tightened on the doorframe. "Come inside," I said. Patricia Odom sat at my kitchen table, with both hands wrapped around a mug of coffee, and told me a story that rearranged everything I thought I knew about the 3 worst years of my life. She and Claire had been close, not best friends, she said, but the kind of colleagues who eat lunch together and cover each other's classrooms and know the important things about each other's lives. Claire had talked to her about the inheritance, about the estate documents, about the phone call she'd made to me. And in the weeks before she disappeared, Claire had confided something else to Patricia, something she had not told me, because she didn't want me involved until she was certain. Claire had found out that Lawrence Wick had been systematically stealing from estates he managed. Small amounts, at first administrative fees that were slightly inflated, disbursement delays that generated extra interest the office collected, but over time, with certain clients, larger transfers, reclassifications of assets, fees for services never rendered. And in my father's estate specifically, Claire had identified what she believed was a diversion of nearly $60,000 through a series of transactions she couldn't fully trace, but that led, she was certain, toward Brandon Wick's personal accounts. Claire had confronted Brandon about it. Patricia told me this quietly, watching my face. She confronted him? I said. She didn't go to Lawrence first. She went to Brandon. I think she told me she thought Brandon might not know his father was doing it, or that Brandon might be willing to correct it quietly without it becoming a legal matter. Patricia looked down at her coffee. She was always trying to give people the benefit of the doubt. That was Claire. I knew that was Claire. I closed my eyes for a moment. According to what Claire had told Patricia in those last weeks, Brandon Wick had not reacted the way she'd hoped. He had been calm at first. He had told her she was mistaken, that she'd misread the documents, that estate accounting was complex, and she shouldn't draw conclusions without expertise. He had been smooth and reassuring in the way that, Claire told Patricia, made her feel more worried rather than less. And then, a week later, Brandon had called Claire and told her that he had found a discrepancy in the documents himself, and that his father was mortified, and they would like to make things right quietly, without involving authorities, and would she come to their office to review the corrected paperwork before she signed the inheritance transfer. Claire had told Patricia she was going. Patricia had told her to be careful. After she disappeared, Patricia said, "I went to the police." I looked at her. I did. I want you to know that. I went to the police and I told them everything Claire had told me. And the detective Garrett, the one working her case, he talked to the Wicks and they said Claire had never come to their office, and there was no meeting, and they couldn't understand what I was suggesting. Lawrence Wick called the police chief. Lawrence Wick was on the city planning board. Lawrence Wick had been handling estates in Knoxville for 30 years and had never had a complaint filed against him. She stopped. Garrett told me I was confusing a private legal matter with a missing persons case and that I should let the professionals handle it. The anger that moved through me in that moment was cold and very quiet, which is the only kind of anger I know anymore. "Why did you wait to come to me?" I asked. Not accusatory. I genuinely needed to understand. Patricia set down her coffee and reached into the canvas tote bag. She pulled out a manila folder and placed it on the table between us. "Because a year after Claire disappeared, I started getting phone calls," she said. "Blocked number. Someone who never said anything, just stayed on the line. I changed my number. 6 months later, it started again. My car was broken into twice. Nothing taken. My principal, a man I've worked with for 12 years, told me last spring that he'd received an anonymous letter suggesting I had filed false reports with police and had a history of making malicious accusations against colleagues. She met my eyes. I have a daughter in college. I have a mother in a memory care facility outside Nashville that costs $4,000 a month. I am a 53-year-old woman, and I was terrified. I nodded. I didn't tell her she should have come sooner. I didn't say it because I understood, in the marrow of an old man's bones, what it is to be afraid and alone and up against people with more power than you. "What changed?" I said. She pushed the manila folder toward me. 3 months ago, a federal audit was opened on Lawrence Wick's firm. I don't know why. It may have been a routine thing. It may have been something else, but it's happening. And when I heard about it, I thought. She stopped, composed herself. I thought that if I had anything that could help, and I stayed quiet, and something happened to your daughter, her voice broke slightly on the last word, I would never forgive myself. I opened the folder. What was inside had clearly taken Patricia months, possibly years, to compile in stolen moments of courage. Printed bank statements with certain transactions highlighted in yellow, screenshots of wire transfers, a timeline she had constructed from records she'd requested, documents she'd obtained through public records requests, and notes from conversations she'd had carefully, quietly, over years with 2 other families who had used Lawrence Wick's firm and found irregularities in their estates that they'd been unable to get anyone to take seriously. There was also a printed email chain. Claire's email. I recognized it immediately. Her personal account, not her school account. The chain was between Claire and Brandon Wick, from the month before she disappeared. The last email in the chain was from Brandon, dated October 9th, 12 days before Claire vanished. I read it slowly. Brandon had written, in the careful language of a man who understood that written words leave records but couldn't resist making the threat anyway, that he hoped Claire would take time to consider the consequences of making accusations she couldn't substantiate, that the estate field was complex, that a kindergarten teacher without legal training making formal allegations against a respected firm could find herself in a very difficult position, that he hoped she had people in her corner who could support her through what was clearly a stressful time following her grandfather's death. Every sentence was polite. Every sentence was a warning. "How do you have her emails?" I asked. "She forwarded this chain to me the morning she received it," Patricia said. "She was scared. She said she wanted someone she trusted to have it, just in case." Just in case. My daughter had been smart enough to know she was in danger. She had been kind enough, and perhaps too trusting enough, to try to handle it without pulling her 60-year-old father into it. And something had happened to her, and I did not know yet what. And the not knowing was the thing that had been eating me alive for 3 years. "Is there anything in here about where she might be?" I asked. Patricia's expression shifted. It was careful, and it was full of a particular kind of sorrow that told me what she was about to say was going to require everything I had left. "There's a name," she said. "In the financial records, one of the transfer destinations. It's a property holding company. I traced it through incorporation records. The registered agent is a woman named Sheila Brand. She's Brandon Wick's former college girlfriend. She owns 3 properties in her name." Patricia turned to a page near the back of the folder. "One of them is a farmhouse in Granger County, about 45 miles from here. It's been continuously drawing utilities for 3 years. Electric, water, but it's not rented through any public listing, and Sheila Brand doesn't live there. She lives in Nashville." I sat with that for a long moment. "You think Claire is there?" I said. "I don't know," Patricia said, and I could see that the not knowing was doing the same thing to her that it had done to me. "I think it's possible someone is there. I think before anyone goes anywhere, this needs to go to federal law enforcement. The audit is already open. If you bring this folder to the FBI field office, I'll go today," I said. "Please," she said. "Please don't go to that property first. Please don't call Garrett. Please go to the federal building downtown and tell them everything." She reached across the table and put her hand over mine. This woman I had never met before this morning. This woman who had been carrying my daughter's secret and her own fear for 3 years. "I need you to be careful, Mr. Mercer. These are people who make problems disappear. You understand what I'm saying?" I understood. I went to the FBI field office that same afternoon. I brought Patricia's folder. I brought every document I had accumulated over 3 years in my own boxes. I brought the notes from my conversations with Pete Allison. I sat across from a young female agent named Reyes, who had the particular focused stillness of someone trained to listen without reacting, and I told her everything, beginning to end, without leaving anything out. Agent Reyes looked through the folder. She asked me questions for 90 minutes. She was particularly interested in the email chain. She was particularly interested in the property in Granger County. She told me that the federal audit on Lawrence Wick's firm had been opened 6 months ago based on a referral from the state banking commissioner. She told me she could not share the details of an ongoing investigation. She told me I had done exactly the right thing by coming to them and not going to the property myself. She also told me to go home, lock my doors, and not contact the Wicks or anyone associated with them. I went home. I did not sleep. I sat at my kitchen table with the copy I had made of Patricia's folder, and I looked at the picture on my refrigerator. Claire at 30, at a 4th of July cookout, laughing at something off camera, holding a sparkler, wearing a blue dress, and I talked to her the way I'd been talking to her for 3 years, out loud in the quiet house, telling her I was close, telling her I was sorry it took this long, telling her that whatever had happened, whatever I was about to find out, she needed to know that not one single day had passed without me looking for her. 7 days after I walked into the FBI field office, Agent Reyes called me. She told me they had executed a search warrant on the property in Granger County at 6 o'clock that morning. My hand gripped the phone so tightly my fingers went white. She told me that they had found my daughter. Claire was alive. I am not going to try to describe what happened inside my chest when Agent Reyes said those words, because there is no description that is adequate. I will only say that I sat down on the kitchen floor. I did not choose to sit down. My legs simply stopped working, and I stayed there for a while, with the phone against my ear, and I listened to Agent Reyes tell me the rest. Claire had been held at that property for 3 years and 3 months. She had been told in the early weeks of her captivity that documents had been filed, false documents, the kind that wealth and legal access can produce, establishing that she had been found to be mentally incompetent, that she had been placed in a private residential facility under a different name, that her father had been notified. She had been told that any attempt to contact the outside world would result in consequences for me. She had been shown a fabricated document suggesting I had signed paperwork agreeing to her placement. She had believed them. Because she loved me, and she could not risk it. Because they had isolated her completely and fed her a controlled version of reality for 3 years. Because what they had done to her was not something that can be summarized simply. It was a sustained and calculated erasure of a person, designed by people who understood exactly how to make someone feel that they had no options and no one coming. She had been cared for physically. She was not in danger of her life in the immediate sense. But what had been done to her was a crime of a different and devastating kind. The kind that takes years of therapy and the rebuilding of a self to begin to recover from. I drove to the hospital where they had taken her. I walked into a room where my daughter was sitting up in a hospital bed, wearing a gown, with an IV in her arm and dark circles under her green eyes. She was thinner than I remembered. Her hair was longer. She looked like Claire, and she looked like someone who had been through something I was not yet equipped to fully comprehend. When she saw me, she said, "Dad," in a voice that was very small. And I crossed the room and I held my daughter, and I did not say anything at all for a very long time, because there was nothing that needed to be said in that moment, and because I had learned, in 3 years of silence, that sometimes the most important thing is simply to be present in the room. Lawrence Wick was arrested 3 days later. Brandon Wick was arrested the same morning. The charges were significant. Estate fraud totaling over $400,000 across multiple clients, unlawful imprisonment, conspiracy, witness intimidation, federal charges, not state. The kind that don't get handled with a phone call to the police chief. Sheila Brand, the woman in whose name the property was held, cooperated with investigators in exchange for consideration on her sentencing. She had not known, she claimed, the full extent of what Brandon was using the property for. The investigators determined she had known more than she admitted and charged her accordingly, though with reduced counts. At sentencing, Lawrence Wick received 14 years. He was 67 years old. His attorney argued for leniency, given his age. The federal judge, a woman with gray hair and wire-rimmed glasses who had clearly heard that argument before, was unmoved. Brandon Wick received 21 years. The judge, in delivering the sentence, said that what Brandon had done to Claire went beyond financial crime, into a category of cruelty that the court found particularly contemptible. The deliberate destruction of a person's sense of reality and connection to the people who love them. Claire received a civil judgment against the Wick firm's assets, $240,000 in the original inheritance, plus damages. It was not enough. No amount is enough, but it was something, and something matters. Detective Garrett was the subject of a departmental review. I do not know what came of it. I know that I will never speak to him again. Patricia Odom came to the hospital the day after I did. I was in the hallway getting coffee from a machine when I saw her come through the doors with a bouquet of yellow flowers, which were Claire's favorite, which I hadn't known Patricia knew. I watched her go into Claire's room. I gave them 20 minutes. When I went back in, Claire was holding the flowers, and Patricia was sitting in the visitor's chair, and they were both crying. The steady, quiet kind of crying that doesn't need to be explained. I am still a history teacher, though I retired at the end of that school year. I still live in the house in Sequoia Hills. The lawn is in better shape than it was for a few years there. I have been known to grill on weekends again. Claire is in therapy. She has been in therapy for almost a year now, and she will be for years more. And that is what healing actually looks like. Not a sudden restoration, but a long and patient reconstruction, one day laid carefully on top of another. She is back in Knoxville. She is not yet back in a classroom, but she has been volunteering at the animal shelter again on Saturdays, which felt, the first time she told me that, like watching a light come back on in a room that had been dark for a long time. We have Sunday dinners again, most weeks. I make her mother's pot roast, which I was never quite as good at as her mother was. And Claire tells me it's perfect, which is a lie, and I tell her she's a terrible liar, which makes her laugh. She has her mother's green eyes. She has her grandmother's stubbornness. She has a laugh that fills up a room. I want to say something to the fathers who might be listening, and to the brothers and the sons and the uncles and the grandfathers, any man who has ever stood on a porch in the cold and felt the particular weight of not knowing where the person he loves has gone. Don't let them tell you to go home and wait. Don't let them tell you there are no leads and nothing to be done. Don't let the dignity of powerful men convince you that your instincts are wrong. A father knows his daughter. A father knows when something isn't right. And that knowing stubborn and inconvenient and impossible to file away in a case folder is sometimes the only thing standing between the person you love and the permanent silence that the wrong people are counting on. I was 60 years old, and I had no investigative training, and I drove a used truck, and I talked to a stuffed rabbit in the dark. And I did not stop. I thought about the cold a lot in those 3 years. The cold that first February when I stood on the porch without a coat. The cold I imagined Claire feeling, somewhere, not knowing I was coming. There is a particular coldness that lives in the space between knowing someone is missing and knowing what happened to them, and I lived in that cold for 3 years. And I know what it does to a person. But I also know this. The cold ended. Spring came the way it always does, indifferent to how long the winter lasted, arriving anyway. And my daughter came home. And sometimes, on Sunday evenings, when dinner is done and the dishes are washed, and Claire is sitting across from me at the same kitchen table where I once sat alone and couldn't eat, we don't say anything for a while. We just sit in the light of the room. And it is enough. It is more than enough. It is everything.